The Man I Have Been Wanting to Quietly Become, written and narrated by Peter J. Merrick. Yesterday I took the ferry over to Coronado Island. It is something I try to do at least twice a week because it forces me to slow down. There is no traffic, no phone calls, and nothing I can do except sit there and watch San Diego slowly disappear behind me. By the time the ferry reaches the other side, my mind usually feels quieter than when I stepped aboard. For the past several weeks, I had been working on an article that simply refused to come together. Every morning, I would get up before sunrise, make a cup of coffee, write a page or two, and then spend the next half hour changing my mind. I have finally accepted that writing is a strange occupation. Half the job is putting words on the page. The other half is wondering why you put those particular words there in the first place. I think the whole thing really started after I came home from spending a few days in Memphis in rural Arkansas. I cannot tell you exactly what changed, but something did. Sometimes life has a way of asking you a question long before you know how to answer it. That was how the last few weeks had felt. When I got off the ferry, I bought a cup of coffee and started walking along the beach with my notebook tucked under my arm. I still laugh every time I buy coffee in California because I quietly complain about the price before I order it. Then I hand over my credit card without putting up much of a fight. I suppose some lessons simply take longer to learn than others. There were people jogging, walking their dogs, riding bicycles, and taking pictures of the ocean. Everyone seemed to have somewhere to go. I seemed to be the only person wandering around with no real destination. Years ago, that probably would have bothered me. These days, I have discovered that some of my best afternoons begin with absolutely no plan at all. I eventually found an empty bench overlooking the Pacific Ocean and sat down. The waves rolled in one after another without the slightest concern for deadlines, stock markets, or whatever happened to be making the news that day. Sitting beside the ocean has become one of my favorite reminders that the world gets along quite well without my help. I find that strangely comforting. Last year I finished writing The Rare Flower. It was a novel I had been working on for several years, and I enjoyed writing it more than any book I have ever written. Stories have always fascinated me because they allow me to explore different parts of myself. Sometimes I know exactly what I am writing about. Other times I only understand it after I've finished. As I sat there looking out at the water, I found myself thinking about Johnny Meadows, the main character in The Rare Flower. When I first created Johnny, I thought I was simply writing a fictional character. Sitting there in Coronado, I started wondering if he had quietly been teaching me something about myself all along. That thought stayed with me as I opened my notebook. Across the top of a blank page, I wrote one question, not how can I become more successful? Not how can I write a better book? Not even how can I become happier? I wrote, who have I been becoming when nobody was watching? For the next hour, I wrote whatever came into my mind. 3 seagulls spent most of that hour following me because they seemed convinced I had something to eat hidden in my backpack. Every time I reached inside and pulled out another notebook or another pen, they looked a little more disappointed. I finally started feeling guilty because I had clearly raised their expectations without meaning to. When I finished, I looked back over the pages. There were 12 simple observations about the kind of men I have admired throughout my life. None of them had anything to do with money, status, or success. They were simply qualities I had quietly noticed in men who made the people around them feel calmer, safer, and more at peace. I closed my notebook and looked back out at the ocean. It suddenly occurred to me that I had not really been trying to write another article during the past several weeks. I had been trying to understand the kind of man I have been wanting to quietly become. The surprising part was that I had already written about him the year before. I had simply given him a different name. His name was Johnny Meadows. As I sat there looking at those 12 observations, I noticed something almost immediately. None of them talked about achievement. There was nothing about money, titles, influence, or recognition. That surprised me because I had spent 35 years helping people build financial security, yet none of those things showed up on my list. Apparently, my heart had been keeping score differently than my resume. When I first entered the financial planning profession in 1991, I was 22 years old and convinced I needed to have all the answers. Looking back, I smile at that young man because he worked very hard. He also worried far more than he needed to. I think that is one of the advantages of getting older. You slowly discover that most of the things you worried about never happened, and many of the things that did happen taught you something you could not have learned any other way. Over the years, I attended more conferences than I could possibly count. I always walked into those hotel ballrooms with the best intentions. I would tell myself that this was the conference where I was finally going to become one of those people who could walk up to complete strangers, introduce himself, and leave with 20 new friends. About 15 minutes later, I usually found myself standing beside the coffee talking to one person while everyone else seemed to know exactly what they were doing. For years, I thought I was bad at networking. It took me a long time to realize I simply enjoyed conversations more than introductions. I never wanted to know how many people I could meet in an afternoon. I wanted to know what made one person think the way they did. Looking back, I do not remember most of the business cards I collected, but I remember dozens of conversations that stayed with me for years. One of the observations in my notebook said, "He listens more than he speaks." I smiled when I read those words because I immediately thought about several men who had influenced my life. None of them were trying to impress anyone. They asked thoughtful questions. They paid attention to the answers. And when you left their company, you somehow felt better than when you arrived. I have always admired people like that because I have also met the opposite. We have all had conversations where someone spends an hour waiting for us to stop talking so they can tell us about themselves. By the time you leave, you know everything about their life and they know almost nothing about yours. Those conversations usually feel much longer than they actually are. As I grew older, I noticed something else. The people I respected most were almost never trying to be the smartest person in the room. They were comfortable saying, "I do not know." That used to surprise me. Today it reassures me because I find myself saying those 4 words much more often than I did 20 years ago. Another observation simply said, "He does not pretend." That one probably made me laugh the hardest because I have spent enough years trying to fit into rooms where I never really felt at home. I do not think I was trying to fool anyone. I honestly believed I was supposed to become more like everyone else. It never occurred to me that perhaps I was simply supposed to become more like myself. Living alone during the past 4 years has taught me that pretending is much harder when there is nobody around to watch the performance. The only person I have left to convince is the guy brushing his teeth in the mirror every morning. Fortunately, he has become much easier to get along with. He still makes mistakes, but he has stopped expecting perfection. As I looked back over those 12 observations, I realized they were not describing extraordinary men. They were describing ordinary men who had quietly learned to live ordinary lives well. They kept their word. They listened carefully. They treated people with respect. They did not seem to need much attention, yet people naturally trusted them. The older I become, the more I think those qualities matter far more than most of the things we spend our lives chasing. Then I looked back at the last sentence I had written in my notebook and smiled. Johnny Meadows was beginning to make a little more sense to me. I had always thought I created him out of my imagination. Sitting there in Coronado, I began wondering if he had simply been built from the best qualities I had quietly admired in other men throughout my life. As I continued reading through my notebook, I noticed something else. Every one of those 12 observations pointed in the same direction. None of them described men who were trying to become more important. They described men who had become more comfortable with themselves. I do not think I would have understood the difference when I was younger. For a long time, I measured life the way most people do. Build a career, earn a good living, raise a family, buy a home, work hard. Those are all worthwhile goals, and I am grateful I had the opportunity to experience all of them. Looking back, though, I realize I spent far less time asking what kind of man I was becoming than I did asking what I was accomplishing. The last 4 years have given me something I did not expect. They have given me time. Time to think, time to write, time to walk, time to sit with a cup of coffee without feeling guilty that I should be doing something more productive. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing those quiet moments as wasted time and started seeing them as some of the most valuable hours in my week. Most mornings, I wake up before sunrise and walk down toward the harbor. The restaurants are still closed, the tourists are still asleep, and the boats rock gently against the docks. The world has not quite started asking anything from me yet, and for an hour or so I get to enjoy something that used to be very rare in my life: complete silence. It is amazing what silence will teach you if you stay with it long enough. When I was younger, silence made me uncomfortable. I always felt like I should be doing something, returning a phone call, solving a problem, planning the next project. Today, I still enjoy working hard, but I no longer confuse being busy with moving forward. They're not always the same thing. One of the observations in my notebook simply said, "He protects his peace." I smiled because 10 years ago I probably would have thought that sounded selfish. Today I think it sounds responsible. You cannot bring peace into another person's life if you have none of your own. A few years ago I wrote a sentence that has quietly become one of the principles I try to live by. Connection must be better than solitude. Those 6 words have changed the way I look at almost every relationship. I still believe deeply in love. I still believe 2 people can build a beautiful life together. I simply no longer believe that being in a relationship is automatically better than sitting across from the ocean with a cup of coffee and your own thoughts in your own company. That realization has taken a surprising amount of pressure out of my life. I no longer feel the need to chase people. I no longer feel the need to convince anyone to stay. The people who genuinely want to be part of your life usually make that decision without being talked into it. Johnny understood that long before I did. When I was writing The Rare Flower, there are scenes where Johnny simply lets life unfold. He tells the truth. He treats people with kindness. He gives them room to make their own choices. At the time, I thought I was writing fiction. Sitting in Coronado, I realized I had quietly been writing lessons I still needed to learn myself. One of the things I admire most about Johnny is that he never seems to be in a hurry to prove who he is. He lets people discover him over time. Looking back, I think that is how trust usually works. It is rarely built through impressive moments. It is built through small, ordinary moments repeated over and over again. As I closed my notebook for a moment and looked back out across the Pacific Ocean, I realized something that probably should have been obvious years earlier. I had spent a good part of my life trying to become successful. Without realizing it, I had slowly started trying to become peaceful instead. For me, that has made all the difference. The longer I sat there, the more I kept coming back to Johnny Meadows. I had spent several years writing his story, but yesterday I realized I'd never really asked myself where he came from. I always assumed I had made him up. Sitting there in Coronado, I started wondering if that was only partly true. People sometimes ask writers where their characters come from. I wish I had a better answer than I do not really know. Every time I start writing a novel, I think I'm in charge. Somewhere around the middle of the book, the characters begin making decisions I never planned, saying things I never expected, and quietly taking the story in directions I never saw coming. Johnny was like that from the beginning. When I started writing The Rare Flower, I never sat down and said, I'm going to create the perfect man. That would have been a terrible story. Perfect people are exhausting. They always know the right thing to say. They never make mistakes. And after a while, you secretly hope they trip over the dog just to prove they are human. Johnny was never perfect. He made mistakes. He had doubts. He carried disappointment. He questioned himself. He sometimes sat quietly before making a decision because he knew that once words leave your mouth, they are difficult to call back. Maybe that was why he always felt real to me. As I thought about him, I realized I'd never admired Johnny because he was strong. I admired him because he never seemed to be pretending. He did not become someone different depending on who walked into the room. Whether he was speaking to a waitress, a billionaire, a child, or quiet storm, he remained the same man. That is much harder than it sounds. Most of us adjust ourselves a little depending on who we are with. We all want to be liked. We all want to make a good impression. I know I have done it more times than I care to admit. Looking back, I think some of the most tiring days of my life were the days I spent trying to become the person I thought someone else wanted me to be. Johnny never seemed to have that problem. He did not need to be the center of attention. He did not feel the need to fill every silence with conversation. He listened because he was interested, not because he had read somewhere that listening was a useful communication skill. There is a big difference between listening because you should and listening because you care. There is a scene in The Rare Flower where Johnny meets Quiet Storm. When I wrote it, I thought I was writing about attraction. Yesterday, I realized I had really been writing about peace. Johnny never tries to impress her. He never performs. He simply allows her to meet the same man everyone else meets. The older I become, the more I think that may be one of the greatest gifts we can give another person. Not a performance, not an image, just ourselves. That was when another thought crossed my mind. Perhaps the reason Johnny felt so real was because he was never meant to represent someone I had already become. Perhaps he represented the direction I hoped I would keep walking for the rest of my life. When I closed my notebook, I smiled because something finally made sense. Last year, I thought I had written a novel about a man named Johnny Meadows sitting on that bench overlooking the Pacific Ocean. I realized I had also written a quiet reminder to myself. Keep becoming that man, not all at once, just a little more each year. As I rode the ferry back to San Diego that afternoon, I folded my notebook and slipped it back into my backpack. I looked back toward Coronado and realized I had not really answered the question I had taken with me that morning. Instead, I had found a direction. Looking back, I think that was better than finding an answer. People sometimes ask me why I decided to make the entire audiobook of The Rare Flower free on YouTube. They usually assume there is some marketing strategy behind it. The truth is much simpler. There is not. For 35 years, I earned my living as a financial consultant. That profession allowed me to provide for my family, raise my children, meet wonderful people, and build a career that I genuinely enjoyed. Writing was always something different. It was never my profession. It was simply the place where I tried to make sense of my own life. Because I never depended on writing to pay my bills. I never had to write what I thought people wanted to read. I could write the stories that mattered to me, even if I was the only one who cared about them. Looking back, I think that freedom may have been the greatest gift my career ever gave me. When I finished The Rare Flower, I realized I did not want someone to miss the story because they could not afford to buy it. If Johnny Meadows had something worthwhile to say, I wanted anyone who was curious enough to be able to spend a few hours with him. Making the audiobook free simply felt like the right thing to do. Sitting on that ferry, I also realized something else. I never really wrote The Rare Flower to tell other people how to live. I wrote it because I was trying to understand myself. Johnny was asking many of the same questions I had been asking for years. I just happened to let him answer them first. I think that is one of the gifts stories give us. We begin reading because we are interested in someone else's life. Before we know it, we are quietly thinking about our own. Every once in a while, a character stays with us because they remind us of something we have almost forgotten about ourselves. That is what happened to me on the bench in Coronado. I thought I was writing another article. Instead, I found myself looking back over 35 years of my adult life and realizing that the men I admired most all seemed to share the same quiet qualities. They listened more than they spoke. They kept their word. They treated people with kindness. They did not need to be the center of attention. And they never seemed to be pretending to be someone they were not. I still have a long way to go. There are days when I overthink things, days when I worry more than I should, and days when I say something I wish I could take back. Fortunately, tomorrow usually gives me another chance to do a little better than I did today. At this stage of my life, that is all I really ask of myself. As the ferry pulled back into San Diego, I stood for a moment and watched the skyline get closer. Nothing around me had really changed. The boats were the same. The water was the same. Even the 3 seagulls were still flying around looking for someone more generous than I had been. The only thing that had changed was the way I was looking at my own life. Those 12 observations are still folded inside the notebook I carried that afternoon. I have no doubt they will change over the years because I hope I keep changing too. Growing older has taught me that life is not really about arriving. It is about paying attention, making small corrections, and trying to become a little more like the person you hope to be than the person you were yesterday. If you decide to spend a few hours with Johnny Meadows in The Rare Flower, I hope you enjoy the story. More than that, I hope it encourages you to ask yourself the same question I asked on that bench overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Who am I becoming when nobody is watching? For me, that has become one of the most important questions I have ever asked. I think I will spend the rest of my life answering it. Peter Merrick, A.K.A. Old Fart, still optimistic because I am not dead yet, and remember this truth, either are you.